Hello, leaders of the world. Welcome to Spread Love in Organizations, a podcast for purpose-driven healthcare leaders striving to make life better around the world by leading their teams with genuine care, servant leadership, and love. I'm Najib, your host, having the privilege to chat today with an amazing thinker, a pioneer in his domains, and an incredible teacher and leader, Professor John Sterman. John is Professor of Management at MIT Sloan and Professor in the MIT Institute for Data, Systems, and Society. He is also the Director of the MIT System Dynamics Group and the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. John's research centers on improving decision-making in complex systems, including corporate strategy and operations, energy policy, public health, environmental sustainability, and climate change. He is the author of many articles on the challenges and opportunities facing organizations today, including the book, Modeling for Organizational Learning, and the award-winning textbook, Business Dynamics. John has received multiple awards and recognitions around the globe and has been featured in several media for his innovative use of interactive simulations in management education and policymaking, particularly in climate change and energy policy. I had the privilege to be John's student, and I can tell you, I see the word differently now. Definitely through a system dynamic lens, but also through a lens of tremendous responsibility we have as leaders to make the world healthier and a more sustainable place. John, I am so honored to have you with me today.
Thank you, Najee. I'm delighted to be here.
John, I would love to learn more about your personal story. From research to MIT to UN, Paris Agreement, what is in between the lines of this incredible journey?
Well, my main field is system dynamics, which is an approach to understanding complex systems, often through developing simulation models. The models aren't the point. The point is the models help us learn and to share that learning journey with other people. And I've been doing that basically my whole career, starting really when I first went to college. And substantively, my main focus has always been what we now call sustainability. We didn't really have that word back in the early 70s, but it's really been a journey about sustainability in all of its forms, not just environment, but sustainable society, also not just environmentally, but also socially, politically, and personally. And so really the journey's been about developing my systems thinking capabilities in every way that I could and trying to share that and go on the learning journey with my students and the people in the organizations with whom I work.
So you shared a little bit a description of what you call system dynamics and all the work that you've been doing. Can you give us a little bit more and kind of an elevator pitch for us? I'm a big believer now of it, but I didn't really know about it before. So
yeah, so very often we face important problems or challenges or opportunities, and we get together with the other key people and we think hard about what should we do and how do we best solve this problem or address this issue. And very often what we implement doesn't work. We call this phenomenon policy resistance. And by policy resistance, I don't mean that we all decide what the right thing to do is, but we can't get it implemented because there's opposition. That happens, of course, but that's not what I mean. Policy resistance is in many ways more damaging. It's the idea that we go through a careful process of thinking through what's the best way to approach the problem. We all agree, and we actually implement it, and it doesn't work. Or, much more insidiously, it works right here, right now, locally and in the short run, but then the problem comes back later over there. And when that happens, it's the consequence of our own decision, but we don't recognize that. Instead, the problem just got worse. Well, that can't be us. It's got to be something out there. There's got to be somebody to blame for that. There's got to be some bad apples in the system. Let's root them out. Let's blame it on the customers. Let's blame it on the suppliers. Let's blame it on the Federal Reserve for raising interest rates, or whatever it might be. Our competitors, the people who are in the opposite political party. And the problem with that is, besides the fact that it's often unethical, because we're usually blaming people we don't like or are afraid of. And so this gives rise to opportunities for our implicit biases to show their ugly heads. But it also just doesn't work. It doesn't solve the problem, because the real source of the problem is the unintended consequences of our own decisions. So I just taught the first class of introductory system dynamics today for our executive MBA students. And I asked them for some examples of this. And well, common examples are, how do you solve traffic congestion? Well, pretty much every city in the world that has terrible traffic congestion, what they do is they build more roads. They add more lanes to the existing roads. And your listeners out there, I'm sure, if they drive in a city, will know that it doesn't work. It works in the very, very short run, but as soon as it becomes a little faster and easier to drive, people drive more, and they move farther away from the city core so they can afford a bigger house with the shorter commute. And that just builds more traffic back up until it's just as bad or often worse than it was before. So that's an example. And there are many, many, many other examples. Why are projects so often late, over budget, and fail to deliver what the customer wanted with high quality? This isn't because of a few bad apples, a few engineers who didn't really know what they were doing, or a few workers who weren't doing the right thing. This happens in every kind of project, in every domain, and it's been happening, for millennia. The Great Wall of China was over budget, and the pyramids were late and over budget. And so it can't be just a few bad apples. It's got to be something about the system. And what system dynamics allows you to do is to work with your colleagues to uncover what those unintended consequences are, how they might actually intensify the pressure you're under and cause you then to move the high leverage policies even more in the harmful wrong direction. And then what can you do about it? So it's a very practical approach to identifying high leverage actions that can actually improve the long run performance and functioning of our systems, make them more effective, healthier, safer for everybody. And then how do you get implementation? So that's a tall order, but that's what we try to help our students and colleagues in other organizations to do.
Definitely. I lived it with the different simulations that we did in class. Before going into leaders and really what you think the role of leaders is within those systems, because I got a lot of learnings from you about this. What took you, in fact, to start researching system dynamics and get so engaged and passionate about it?
Well, so you really want my origin story here. So in high school, I was a nerdy kid interested in science fiction and the future, and I was reading all the futurologists and so forth. And my father, who was a research chemist, brought me an article one day when I was, I think, a junior or senior in high school. And it was one of Jay Forrester's famous articles, then brand new, called Counterintuitive Behavior of Social Systems. It's available online. It's still a wonderful article. And I read this, and it made a huge impression on me. I got a copy of his then brand new book called World Dynamics. And what distinguished this approach for me was Forrester wasn't defensive about his model or his viewpoint. The book wasn't very long. Every assumption in his simulation model was out in the open. Nothing was hidden. And he was very upfront. He said, look, this is complicated and difficult, and this is a first cut, and it's wrong. It's incomplete. And all the equations are here. So please, everybody out there, help me improve the model. That's extraordinary. That was unheard of back then. All the other futurology analysts were saying, here's my view and it's right, and all the other views are wrong and defensive and, off-putting. And here's Forrester inviting anybody in. Now, I was a high school kid. I had access to a computer, which was, the consequence of, quite a lot of privilege, I understand. But I took him seriously. Why couldn't I replicate what he did? And I started to do that. And then when I went to college, I kept working on that. And it turned out through one of these serendipities that you can never plan, but decisively changes the pathway of your life. Two of the people who had been working very closely with Jay Forrester at MIT had just left MIT and joined the faculty where I was a freshman in college. So I found out that they were there, never had met or even heard of them before, but I discovered they were working on the same kind of thing that I was trying to do. And I went and introduced myself and then changed my major from what was going to be physics to focus on complex systems, and with a focus on sustainable environment, we called it. And then I came to MIT for my PhD. And when I finished that, well, you know what happens when you finish a PhD. You can't get a real job. You have to become a professor. So I stayed on the faculty here at the Sloan School, and I joined the faculty here 40 years ago. So, and I'm very, very happy that that's the turn that my life took way back then in the 70s.
Oh, thank you so much, John, for sharing part of your story and journey. And going to your research, what you've been doing with corporations, NGOs, the work you've done with governments, UN. I really remember at one of the first courses you taught us was exactly what you said today, is the system, right? But the key point for me was, many times as citizens or leaders, we talk about the system as if it's someone else building it, but
right.
Rather your full point is, us as leaders, we need to create a system and environment for people to thrive. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, this is such an important point. One way that people often hear the idea that, we are embedded in complex systems, and a lot of the things we sincerely try to improve the situation actually make things worse. They interpret that as bad news, that, we are small cogs in an overwhelmingly complex machine, and there's no way we can influence it. And some people actually get discouraged and say, so why bother trying? There's nothing I can do. I'm too small to have any influence on what's going on. Only somebody with more authority, my boss or the CEO or, the president. Yeah, and I think this is a huge mistake. First of all, everybody has influence. Everybody has some ability to change the system. So the point is, yes, we are all embedded in complex systems that shape our behavior. And if we're not mindful about that, it's going to feel like we're being, that we are just leaves being tossed around on winds over which we have no control, and where we end up is completely beyond our ability to influence. But what's really going on, I think, is that, yes, we are embedded in complex systems that we largely designed collectively, the nature of our organizations, the nature of our societies, the norms and the laws and the cultures we've created. And so we are responsible for those. If you're a leader in an organization at any level, and for me, that means you could be a frontline hourly worker in a chemical plant or in a retail store. You're a leader because you influence other people. And of course, it's also applicable if you're the C-suite, the CEO, chairman of the board. You're responsible for changing those systems. Try to blame people for problems, that's not going to work. But identify how we could change the system. And then if we do that well, ordinary people, and on average, everybody's getting average people across the world, those people are going to be able to achieve extraordinary results. Change the system, you change people's behavior. Change the people, different people placed in the same system will generally behave in much the same way that the pressures on the system dictate. So the role of leadership is not just to find and nurture extraordinary talent, it's to design the system so that ordinary people can do great things. It's a totally different focus than what much of leadership is perceived to be about.
Wow. Design a system so that ordinary people can do great things. What do you think then our focus as leaders, moving forward in healthcare, as this is for healthcare, but also beyond in any industry, for the future of our humanity, I would say?
Well, so I don't claim to be an expert on healthcare, although I've done a little work in the domain. So in the US healthcare system, we know that it's not working very well. If you're privileged, if you're affluent, if you're urban, if you're white, you and you're employed, you probably get very good care, especially if you live in a big city with top hospitals. But if you're unemployed or in a job with poor benefits, or you are rural, say Native American, or poor, or Black, Hispanic, you probably have not very good health care. And the consequence of that, including for the affluent privileged people, is that the United States spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world by any metric. It's a larger fraction of the GDP than other countries, and we have the biggest GDP. So it's now, 18, 19, 20% of the GDP of the United States goes to healthcare. So it's trillions of dollars a year. It's almost double per capita spending on healthcare in the US versus other developed advanced economies. And we have nowhere near the best healthcare in this country, and even more important, nowhere near the best health. Healthcare and health aren't the same thing, right? What we'd really like is a system that keeps everybody healthy so you don't need care very often. And when you do, you get great care at reasonable cost. That's not the system we have. And this is true despite decades and decades of reform efforts. So, if you're a frontline care provider in the clinic, your mission is very clear. People are going to come to you. They're going to be in distress. They're going to be afflicted with various conditions, some of them very acute and life-threatening, COVID, for example, or a heart attack, or a stroke, or an aggressive cancer. And your job is do what you can to treat them. And so because those kinds of problems are critical and they're urgent, and everybody in your audience, and including myself, has been in the situation personally and with our family members where one of us is suffering in that way, and we know we want treatment right away. And we have an ethical duty, if you're a care provider, to do that. The problem is all of that energy and all of those resources and all of that focus comes at the expense of investment in, let's call it, true prevention. True prevention is not, well, you have high cholesterol, let me put you on a statin. I'm not saying that's unimportant. I'm saying that that's not real prevention. You're already afflicted with hypercholesterolemia. You already have high cholesterol, but the real problem is, how did that happen? And it's not just genetic predisposition. It's also the environment in which you're embedded. What kind of food do you eat? What kind of food is affordable for you? And other aspects of the community situation. Do you live in a food desert where you can't get healthy food, where broccoli costs more than burgers? You're going to be eating the wrong kinds of things. We systematically underinvest in genuine prevention. Genuine prevention is things like addressing the systematic inequities and disadvantages that create food deserts, that cause food that's not really food, that's highly processed and obviously bad for your health, to be cheaper and more widely available than healthy food. And if you want to address that, you've got to deal with things like, well, how do we get the junk food out of our schools and the soda and the sweetened beverages? And how do we get sidewalks in every community so kids from the earliest age can develop healthy habits around physical activity by making it safe for them to walk or bike to school instead of having to be driven? How do we reinforce healthy eating habits throughout the society? That's where true prevention begins, the most upstream activity. And those investments are systematically weakened and left begging when healthcare costs go up because more people are afflicted. So there's a vicious cycle there, right? More people are afflicted with diabetes or obesity or hypertension or whatever. Healthcare costs go up. The budget isn't that big and it's not growing very fast because it's so large already. And so resources for prevention are squeezed and cut even more. And that creates a vicious cycle. Now, that vicious cycle can be reversed, right? Every vicious cycle could become a virtuous cycle if we could begin to deploy policies that improve people's health, genuine prevention, with a long delay, but eventually you're going to see health improve. As health improves, healthcare costs for treatment would go down. And if, and it's a big if, but if the resources freed up in that fashion were reinvested in further prevention, now health would improve even further, freeing up even more resources. That turns what today is a vicious cycle, driving us to a more and more unhealthy, expensive care system, into a virtuous cycle that boosts our health and allows care to become even better and more equitably distributed. Now, this is hard to do, but there are examples, other countries, but also places in the US that have begun to focus more on healthy food, access to healthy food, helping people learn how to cook healthy food and support one another in that, and beginning to see the impact on, for example, the incidence and prevalence of type 2 diabetes and its many, many harms. And then the resources can be reinvested. So the fact that this is happening, even if it's only happening in a few places, well, listen, anything that exists is possible. And it says we could do this if we understood better the system we're in and were able to deploy those policies.
That's an amazing illustration of system dynamics in action with the loops of it. And it's really, a great way to look at things. And many times we look at the symptoms rather than looking exactly what's causing them and how we can reverse the trend. I would love now to go into a section where I will give you one word and would love to get one reaction from you. Okay. So the first word is leadership.
Distributed responsibility. Okay, that was 2 words.
That's fine. Tell me more about distributed.
So, very often I'll hear people in an organization say, I get what you're saying, but I don't have any power. Only my boss could do what you're asking us to do. And then you go talk to the boss, and the boss will say, yeah, I get it, but I don't have any ability to make those changes. Only my boss can do it. And you can go all the way up the hierarchy. Pretty soon you're talking to the CEO, the big boss person. And the CEO says, I get it, but I don't have the ability to do that because, if I was to do this, things might get better in the long run, but in the short run, my costs are going to go up and it's going to create all kinds of disruption and the shareholders will never sit still for it. I'd get fired by the board if I did this. And so I have no power. And then you go to the board, you go to the analysts on Wall Street who are, asking the questions in the earnings guidance calls, and they all say the same thing. And everybody feels that they're powerless. The president of the United States, everybody thinks the president of the United States has got to be the most powerful person in the world. They don't see themselves that way. You look at any president from any party in recent history, probably going all the way back to George Washington, and they feel constrained and bottled up because of all the pressures they're under, that they can't do what they really want to do. Well, as long as we have that view of leadership, we're never going to get where we want to go. What we've got to do is recognize everybody's a leader. Everybody has influence. We're not going to be able to make changes even if we have huge amounts of positional authority. That, I could fire you, Naji, if I'm your boss, but that doesn't really help me improve the system, right? So we're going to have to view it as a collective process where leadership is distributed throughout the entire organization, throughout the entire society, and nurture a conversation with everybody using, I hope, systems thinking tools so that we can identify the high leverage policies and avoid the low leverage policies, and reach some sort of collective understanding and agreement about what needs to be done. And if there are situations where doing the right thing entails some short-run sacrifice, like we're going to have to spend more in the healthcare story in the short run so that we can keep treating people who are afflicted today, which is our ethical duty. We can't just say, sorry, I need the money for something else. We're not treating you today. So we have to keep doing that and increase our investment in genuine prevention. Short-run costs are going to go up. Long run, they're going to go way down. We're going to all have to be willing to bear that short-run cost together equitably, or it'll never get done.
What about climate change?
I'm going to say, again, I'm going to give you two words: tough, but solvable. And it's tough for all the reasons we just talked about. My colleague, Nicholas Stern, says climate change is the mother of all market failures. And what he means is it's the classic case of an environmental externality, to use the economic jargon, meaning when you use fossil fuels and generate greenhouse gases, you get the benefit of that flight, of driving around, of all the activities you do that create carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas pollution. But the costs of those activities, the harms, the sea level rise, the crop failure, the heat, extreme heat, the flooding, the extreme weather, and on and on and on, the species extinction, the wildfires, I mean, the list is very long. Those consequences are distributed across the entire world and into the future. So you get private benefit and the costs are diffuse. So it's in your interest, if you're thinking about it from a narrow, selfish economic point of view, to keep using carbon. So this is a very familiar idea. It's known as a market failure or the tragedy of the commons. And because climate change affects everybody and we all share the same atmosphere, and because the impacts are happening here today, right now, but also will be much worse in the future, it's super easy for people to say, yeah, I understand we need to cut our carbon footprint, but it's really somebody else's responsibility. People in the United States say China has to do it. China says the United States and Europe have to do it. And so we kind of have this situation of gridlock and inaction. So it's an extraordinarily difficult problem, but it's a solvable problem. It's not too late to limit global warming, expected warming, to 2 degrees C or less above pre-industrial levels. It's very late, let's be clear, there's no time to waste. The situation is urgent, but it's not too late. And every 1/10 of a degree of warming we can avoid by taking action is making a safer world. Not a safe world, but a safer world than where we're heading without action. And so that's good news, right? If the laws of physics were such that it's too late and nothing we do could avoid catastrophe, well, there's no arguing with the laws of physics. But we're not quite in that situation yet. And so the barrier is whether people are going to be able to muster the collective understanding and action to put in place the policies that will cut our emissions fast enough and deeply enough to limit the warming and make for a safer world. We can still do it, but it's urgent that we take action right away.
And one of the things you shared, it's our personal responsibility also to take actions on this. And I think, as you said, it might feel sometimes challenging, not, no benefits short term.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you allow me to put the simulation on the page for listeners to see it,
of course.
It's just frightening what will happen if we keep.
Well, it's frightening and it's empowering. So I actually ran a workshop this morning with a group of executives from a large company, and they went through the simulation. And I asked them, this was online, so I asked them to put into the chat, how do you feel now after doing this? How do you feel emotionally? Not, what do you think is the answer to climate change? And as usual, there was a range of reactions. Some people wrote they were worried or scared, but most of them wrote things like encouraged, hopeful, empowered. And the reason for that is the simulation, which is rigorously grounded in the best available peer-reviewed science, it doesn't pull any punches. You can try all kinds of ideas in the simulation. This is called the En-ROADS climate policy simulation, developed by my group at MIT in partnership with Climate Interactive, a nonprofit founded by some of our former students. And it can be scary because there's no simple answer for this. But what people are able to do is they decide what actions to try. Nobody tells them what to do. They explore it for themselves, and they're able to identify high leverage policies, which collectively can get us where we want to go, get us on the pathway towards a safer world. That's empowering. A lot of people come into an exercise like this with the view that climate change is overwhelmingly complex, overwhelmingly huge. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm just feeling depressed. And people sometimes, before we do this, they talk about feeling despair over the prospects for themselves and their children. Well, people in despair are not going to be very effective in creating change. And what the simulation does when it works well is you get people saying, well, I feel encouraged.
What about beer game?
Well, so let me make one more comment before we talk about beer, which is always a fun subject. But you asked a minute ago about personal action to address the climate problem. And most people think about personal action as, I should drive less, I should fly less, I should recycle, I should maybe insulate my house and put solar on my roof if you're fortunate enough to own your own house. And that's important. I think people need to walk their talk. It's not going to work for me to say, Naji, you cut your carbon footprint. I get to keep driving as much as I want in my gas guzzler and flying around as much as I want. So yeah, people need to take personal action to cut their own personal carbon footprint. But that's only one dimension of personal action. There's at least two more. One is to take action professionally in your role, in your career, in your job, in your profession, whatever it is, for-profit company, large or small, nonprofit, government. And that means work with other people to build shared understanding and change the way that organization, that company behaves. cutting the emissions of the company, having the company partner with other folks in their ecosystem, the suppliers, the customers, so that emissions throughout the supply chain can come down. And to do that with the other players in the industry so that standards can be set that will help everybody do that and still be able to compete vigorously for market share. And then there's a third and even more important dimension, which is, I'll call it, to take action politically. And that means to get out there and get active as a citizen. We're not going to solve the climate problem just because everybody drives a little less or recycles. We need to do that, but it's nowhere near enough. We're going to have to change the incentives, the regulations, the conditions in our society that favor the use of fossil fuels and instead accelerate the deployment of zero carbon renewables, energy efficiency, and the other actions that can get us where we need to go. That's going to require changes in regulations, in laws, in incentives that come from the government at all levels, from the town you live in to the national government level to the international level. That's not going to happen unless individual citizens band together and demand change. So that's personal action, but it's getting politically active. And all three of those, I think, are necessary.
So the third word, I'd love your reaction, is beer game.
Okay, so the beer game is an interactive role-play simulation that was created here at MIT in the System Dynamics group way back in the early 1960s, or actually even a little before. So I wasn't involved, of course. I was 5 years old in 1960. So it's a role-play simulation of a supply chain. And initially, it was based on Jay Forrester's very first System Dynamics model, which was a model of the General Electric Corporation's appliance division, so refrigerators and stoves and these kinds of things. And they were going through boom and bust cycles, and that model helped understand how that happened and what could be done to smooth them out and lower costs. And pretty quickly, the folks in the System Dynamics group here, way back in 1958, 59, 60, thought this would make a great teaching exercise. And so they turned it into a tabletop role-play game with a board representing the physical supply chain and chips and markers representing the inventory and the orders. And they called it the refrigerator game. And they very quickly learned that MIT undergraduates, for example, were not that keen on playing something called the refrigerator game. So around 1960 or so, somebody in the group came up with the idea of calling it the beer game. Now, there's no alcohol in the game, and it doesn't promote drinking, and we run it with young people or in settings where drinking is not sanctioned. Then it's the root beer game or the apple juice game. But when they called it the beer game, all of a sudden undergraduates were very interested in playing the beer game. And once you get them in the room, then there's an opportunity for learning. It's the same game, the lessons are the same, it's just the cover story is different. So this game has now been played by hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. Most of the top business schools use it. Many other universities and even high schools use it, and many, many companies use it. And it's been used extensively in organizations that aren't in manufacturing and don't have any physical inventory or supply chain in that sense. I've run it in government agencies, in service businesses, in financial enterprises where there's no physical inventory at all. And it always works great because it's not really about how you manage your supply chain. It's really about what happens when you're in a complex system and things don't go well, and you start blaming your customer, blaming your supplier, blaming your teammates, and then that spirals out of control into a breakdown of trust and even worse performance. That's what the beer game's really about. And it's historically, it's always been played on a board, a tabletop, very effective that way. When the pandemic hit, I created an online version that we could run with people remotely or with social distancing. And it works fantastically well. Just 2 weeks ago, I ran it for senior executives, the top people in a large aerospace company, and right in the middle of a very complex supply chain, experiencing lots of difficulties as the pandemic has whipsawed their industry. And it went very, very well. And the focus was the deeper lessons about how we get overwhelmed by problems and events and then lash out by blaming other people, and how that then destroys the possibility of high performance, breaks down trust, leads to resentment, and then what you can do about it. Those are the real lessons of the game.
The last word is spread love in organizations.
I'm not sure I have one word for you here, but let me tell you what, when I explained how I got into the field, I mentioned that there were two folks who had been at MIT and then joined the faculty at my undergraduate college. So those people were Dennis and Dana Meadows, and they became my mentors and friends. And they are the authors of the most famous system dynamics book ever written, called Limits to Growth. And it's well worth reading even today, about 50 years after publication. And over the years, they published a variety of updates. And there's one update in particular, it's a little older. It's in a book called Beyond the Limits that I'm sharing with you right here. And so a lot of it is technical, what's going on in the environment, what's going on with the ozone and the climate and resources and energy, and how do they all interact. But then Dana, who largely wrote this book, turns to the question of how do we create a sustainable society? And she talks a lot about what's needed technically, but then she talks about what she thinks are the more fundamentally important changes in the way we interact with one another and the way, our way of being, basically. And she identifies a set of things that we needed to do in order to be effective. One is visioning. You've got to create a positive vision of where you want to go, a sustainable society that's fair and equitable and creates opportunity for everybody to have a more fulfilling life. Another one is networking. You can't do this alone. You've got to build a community of people who support each other, who can help each other. The third one she mentions is truth telling. We can't pretend that somehow technology is going to magically save us or the market will automatically solve all these problems. That's not true. We've got to be honest with ourselves. We can't say it's too late, we're doomed, and you can't say everything's going to be fine. The truth is more subtle and more complex. The next one she talks about is learning. I think this is pretty clear. Everybody's got to be in to cultivate an attitude that I'm always here to learn. I don't already have all the answers. I want to be more in a posture of learning together with other people instead of advocating solutions I already believe in. And the last one is loving. And let me just read very briefly what she said about this. She said, "We are not allowed in modern culture to speak about love except in the most romantic and trivial sense of the word. Anyone who calls upon the capacity of people to practice brotherly and sisterly love is more likely to be ridiculed than to be taken seriously. The deepest difference between optimists and pessimists is their position in the debate about whether human beings are able to operate collectively from a basis of love. In a society that systematically develops in people their individualism, their competitiveness, and their cynicism, the pessimists are in the vast majority." And I think, and she goes on to talk about what it would mean to act from a position of love, which is more than empathy, but that's required. It's more than care for other people. it's the belief that even though we often don't behave this way, that we have the capacity for good, we have the capacity to sacrifice for the common good, and that we can nurture that orientation and that capability. And that it's not a sign of weakness to talk about love in that way. And I got to tell you, this is hard to do. Dana she passed away in the year 2001. She was an amazing person, an incredibly influential mentor, and I strongly urge folks to go and search out her writing. She was a syndicated newspaper columnist for many, many years, a MacArthur Genius Award winner for that work, and most of her writing is available freely online, and it's really amazing how relevant it remains to this day. I find it personally difficult to live up to her standards, but I try as best I can. And, if people want to say that talking about love in that way, or the capacity for people to sacrifice for the common good and for the future, is naive, then so be it. If there's an old joke that goes like this, people say, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And the way I answer it is, optimists proclaim this is the best of all possible worlds. And the pessimists say, that's right. I don't believe we live in the best of all possible worlds. I think we can improve our world. We can make a better world, but it's not going to happen unless we take action. We have to stand up and take responsibility for that. We have to do it by visioning, by networking, by learning, by truth-telling, and by loving. And I firmly believe that it's possible. And not only that, but we've done similar things before. Climate change is really tough. But, I've seen some amazing things happen even in my short life. I remember as a kid, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was small, but, when every adult around you is palpably scared that we're all going to be annihilated in a nuclear holocaust any second now, you're never going to forget that. I never am going to forget that. When I grew up during the Cold War, we did duck and cover drills, which of course would have been useless in the event of a nuclear attack. But people thought this was going to happen. And it hasn't happened so far. Still plenty of nuclear weapons in the world, of course. But nobody of my generation, nobody in the Cold War thought that the Soviet Union would fail and that the Iron Curtain would come down, that the Berlin Wall would be torn down. And it did. And it came down peacefully. Nobody thought that there would be an end to apartheid in South Africa, or if it ended, people thought it would only happen after a long and bloody civil war. But it ended, and it ended peacefully. Nobody thought that the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland would ever be resolved. And after the Good Friday Accords, the violence has essentially stopped. Now, listen, I'm not naive. I understand there's plenty of racism in the world. There's plenty of hatred between the people on each side in Northern Ireland, but they aren't killing each other. That's a big deal. And there are many other examples of things that we collectively have done that nobody thought would ever happen. So I wouldn't call it optimism. I think what I'd say is I'm hopeful. And for me, hope is not the belief that everything's going to be okay. It's not, especially if we don't take action. Instead, it's the stance that says it's not too late, that we can still create a better, more sustainable, equitable, fair, prosperous, and wonderful world. And that what we do individually and collectively matters. That's what hope is, that we can do it. And with it comes that recognition that we need to get busy and we need to do it together. So Naji, let's get busy.
I was going to ask you a final word of wisdom if you have for leaders, but I think you just said it. Let's get busy and we can do it. But anything else you want to share before we close it today?
No, that's plenty. Let's get busy.
Let's get busy. Thank you so much, John, for this inspiring transformational chat.
Oh, thank you, Naji. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you all for listening to Spread Love in Organizations podcast. Follow us on LinkedIn and social media, subscribe on your preferred podcast platform, and connect with us on SpreadLoveIO.com. Most importantly, spread love in your organizations and spread the word around you to inspire others and amplify this movement our world so desperately needs.